us wrap our heads around open systems theory and the intrinsic motivators fundamental for the sustained success and productivity of any group. Please welcome Dave Witney.
Yay!
Hi everyone. The conference fatigue hasn't started to set in yet. There's still a few more sessions to go, but I'm going to move to my session today. It is a mouthful of marbles trying to describe what I'm talking about, but hopefully I can get that meaning across to you. Open systems theory, the 6 criteria for productive groups. I'm going to do a bit of scene setting first off with what's happening in terms of the changing world. I'm going to tell a true story about miners in the 1950s. And I'm going to talk more about open systems because that gives you a bit more context before we slip into actually talking about the 6 criteria as well. If I run out of time, we'll see how we're going. Should be pretty right. We'll see how we go. Okay. The world is changing. In fact, it always has been and always will. Change is not new. Change has been around for a very long time. In fact, if you look at history, we'll see that there's a lot more change in the world historically than we're actually having now. Though we perceive it right now as being quite accelerated. That's our perception. But if you think about things like the cultural revolutions of the 60s, if you think about post-war Europe or post-war times, massive migrations, change is not new. Change is something that we've been adapting to ourselves for a very long time. In Agile, we tend to focus down in looking at purposeful people, the people space, and this is a good thing. We also look at the system around that, the organisations that are around that. We also look at the next space up from that. This is the system within the system, or the system surrounding that system, which is the open, our industries or marketplaces, what's called the task environment. This is quite often where, if you like, the customers live, but it's also where our competitors live, okay? And we tend to focus out to that space, especially if we're doing things like design thinking or business agility as well. So we tend to go that far out quite often, okay? We don't tend to go out into the space outside of that, what's called the wider social field, okay? We do to a degree, but not always. It's increasingly important though, because what's happening in the world affects all of that. All of these imaginary circles that I've drawn, and they are imaginary, they're not actually real, they're actually things that we create to understand things, are interconnected, in interrelationships as well, both going out and inwards. So the purposeful people work within the organisations, the organisation works within that industrial market space, the industrial market space works within the ever-changing world. These are just containers. If you look at the drawing there, you can see the purposeful people are actually in all of those spaces, okay? It's really important to understand that there's interrelationship going on, okay? That the information or exchange of information, exchange of all sorts of things is going on all over the place. Okay. In the external world, what's happening is that's interacting in a way, okay? That's interacting within itself. What you've got within the industry or within the system is it's interacting with itself as well, but it's really important to understand that's interacting with the external world in both directions. Okay. Really important because what's happening at the moment, and historically it's been happening forever, is that world is changing and we have to be actually able to adapt or be adaptive in that space. You can see things like the application of AI. If you talk to CEOs, they're not so much worried about Agile right now, they're probably more worried about what's my company going to be like in a week's time, a month's time, based on artificial intelligence changing how we work. Okay? We're looking at things that were recently affecting us like global warming, the changes in the energy market. We're looking at things like a land war in Europe. Who would have imagined that would happen? Maybe some of you did. But what does that mean for people who are dependent on Ukraine's wheat? What happens for that in the geopolitical space as well? VR and AR, virtual reality and augmented reality, hasn't really fulfilled its promise yet, I don't think, but it certainly could change how we work quite significantly. Pandemic and post-pandemic effects. Okay, we're still living with things like working from home. That probably won't go back. Okay, that's a change that's sort of like been accelerated. My wife, for example, is affected by that quite significantly. My wife's a diabetes educator. And what's happened in her industry is that the effects of post-viral effects of the pandemic means that there's a lot more people having diabetic sort of incidences sooner, or coming to diabetes sooner. Flexible work practices and working from home is something that's changed how we work, and there's also rising mental health issues out there as well within society. What we have quite often is technical change. We don't often think about the associated social change that is associated with that, or comes along with it. Open systems theory is actually if you like, the offspring of socio-technical systems as well. Okay. So what's happening is we've got a constantly changing world. Change is constant. The world is not static. And in that space, we actually need to have strategy. Not just any old strategy. We actually have to be actively adaptive in a strategy in the changing world. That means we're not passive in that space. We have to be active in it. We need people, but not just any people. We actually need engaged, purposeful people. And we need the conditions or systems that support both those things, what we would call a continuously adaptive system. Okay? So our organisations have to actually start thinking about how they can be continuously adaptive. Or as Fred Emery says, instead of constantly adapting to change, why not change to be adaptive? Okay? Cool. Now I'm going to tell a little story. I'm going to bring this all over a bit, okay? How am I going for time? Excellent. Okay. So what's going on? This is a true story from the 1950s about the UK coal industry. It's based on 8 years of work by Fred Emery and Eric Trist. And what was happening was there was changing the industry. People getting to grips with like the industrialisation of that industry. There were new machines and new methods, but the industry was in freefall. There was something going on. Something had changed quite drastically. So Fred and Eric decided to see what was going on. So drillers were drilling, pickers were picking, and shovelers were shoveling. Cutters were cutting. This was a new technology. Longwall mining. It required cutters to come along and cut the coal from the coal face. But what was happening was there were lots of blame, lots of fights. Productivity was down, absenteeism was going through the roof, people weren't turning up for work. Turnover was high. This is important in this industry. You realise in the 1950s, a lot of these miners had been part of families who'd been miners. This was actually a generational thing. But for the first time, people were just not going back. Okay, so people were actually leaving the industry. Quality was down, and because quality is down, in quite a physical industry, injuries and sickness are up. And there are mental health issues. Okay? So what's going on? Why would that be? Why would that be so different? So the difference here was that drillers were just drilling, whereas previously drillers were also digging, and drillers were also doing other things. This is a fundamental change in how they operated. But not all of the collieries were going through the same sort of a problem. There were 3 collieries in particular, after about 3 to 6 months of this happening, which were starting to buck the trend. Something different was happening there. So Fred and Eric went off to find out what was happening. And here's what they found. They found that in these mines, or in these collieries, they were sharing skills. They weren't just sticking with their singular skill. There's a higher level of self-organisation. In the morning when they turned up for work, they would decide how they would work. Housework was done. So in mining, housework means you don't leave the shift in a way that actually makes the next shift harder. That was a big difference in these collieries. They're actually leaving things in a good state for the next shift to pick things up. And they were also finding that they were actually doing a handover of those shifts as well. That was really high importance in terms of actually having self-organisation, because it meant they knew what the last state was in, so they could fix things up and do things differently. And there were high levels of ownership. The result for the management was that productivity was high, low absenteeism, and miners were helping miners. So 6 common things started to emerge that they were seeing there. So this was based on their research. This has been refined over the last 50 years. Well, that's all was the miners had elbow room or autonomy. They were able to make decisions. Not all of the decisions, but more decisions than the other collieries were seeing. There was continual learning. Instead of just specialising in this group does the drilling, there are many people learning about how to use the drills, or the cutters, or the conveyor belts. Okay? There was variety in their work. Because of the fact that they were actually multi-skilling, they were able to do different varieties of work. They had different options in the morning. There was mutual support and respect as well. So if somebody was injured or sick, or there were problems, people actually stepped in and helped. So this is actually about being helpful with each other. And there was meaning in the work. This was a big deal. Okay, meaningfulness in a town in the northern England meant that for them, the collieries, that their towns were surviving. So if a mine in northern England in the 1950s went under, it wasn't just the mine that suffered, the entire town suffered. The baker didn't have a job, there was no school, the town would basically collapse without that industry supporting it. It was also meaningful to them in that they knew that the coal was actually important in that time. Okay, coal's maybe got less of a shine to it now than it did back then. But then, back then, post-war, this was fueling the entire nation. This was the stuff that was actually helping all of the other things to happen, to generate power for what was an emerging nation post-war. And they had a desirable future. They were able to think about what they were going to do next. They were able to think about how they were learning and how they were going to progress their careers. Their jobs didn't feel like they were in a dead end. Okay? So is that important now? Does that actually resonate these days? If you've ever done, hands up if you've ever done a social contract or social agreement with groups. Okay, cool. Just about everyone, okay? Or been part of one. You'll see common things emerging. What I found when I discovered what Fred Emery had done and Merrelyn and Fred was that the same sort of things they had been doing, we've been doing for a long time. And a lot of that work that we've done actually were data points which actually correlated with what they were talking about. So you were seeing similar sorts of things come up in these sorts of retros or in these social agreements. Things like, I have a say in what I do, we have some autonomy, we have a growth mindset, we're investing in learning, but also we're challenged by the work, which is really important, it can't be too simple. We have variety, not the same thing every day, the rhythm is not too much. Okay? So these things are optimal. You don't want to have too much of any of these first three. Mutual support and respect. You see this come up a lot in retros or in talks in social contracts or social agreements. Meaningfulness. The work is purposeful and you can see things end to end. So it's not just about knowing the purpose of what we're doing, but knowing my place in that purpose as well, and knowing what I'm doing and how that serves that purpose. And they have a desirable future, not a dead-end job. So these things are not just important to the miners in the 1950s. What you can see there is the product donor group at CBA in 2015. Well, I don't know if there's anyone in the room today. It'd be nice to actually go talk to them at some point. But they display these sorts of qualities. So I'm not talking about teams so much. This actually applies to any sort of group or any sort of collection of people. Definitely we can apply it to team space though. Okay, a little bit more about open systems. Cool. I didn't come up with this myself. In fact, Fred and Merrelyn were saying they didn't come up with this stuff themselves either. But this is just stuff that the data that they brought in, and when they were working in the mines, the little miners, they came up with this stuff, not them. This is really important. Okay, quite often when we're talking about coaching or helping people, we're actually taking away their agency. Fred and Merrelyn did. They basically went there to help solve the problems and see what things emerged. This was 50 years ago, or more than 50 years ago now. It's social science of 50 years. It's scientific inquiry. It's practical applications of doing it and learning from it. So continually learning and refining. Also open systems are sort of in the name. Okay, it's an open system. When we're talking about the open system, we're not talking about this closed system, which we quite often get stuck in the Agile space, to be honest, where we're talking about just the organisation or just the task environment in terms of what's happening in the industry. That's actually about integrating them with what's happening in the world. Okay? There's two important, if you like, basics that I need to actually get your heads around before we move on to actually working on the 6 criteria. And they are redundancy of function and the 2-stage model. I'll do this pretty quickly there, because I'll run out of time otherwise. Now, when speakers like Jonathan and Steve were talking about some of the things that they were talking about in terms of what's happening in the world, they were talking about a redundancy of parts type model. This is sort of like the dominant sort of approach to design. With design principles as well, there's really only 3, and you get to choose which one, okay? And sometimes it's appropriate to have this design principle, to have this redundancy of parts model. It's fairly rare that it's actually useful these days. That's where people have one function, okay? And people are treated as parts, okay, because of that. Because they have a singular function, there needs to be coordination and control because they actually have to coordinate across things. People are treated then as replaceable parts. It's pretty awful. Pretty common, yeah? Anybody experiencing that at the moment? In their teams? To a degree? Okay, good, that's fantastic. Okay. Redundancy of function is what a lot of open systems theory is based upon in terms of a principle. The people, the control, and the coordination are there to get to the completion of whatever it is the task that they're working on. People can do multiple things, which means that they can actually move about there, and actually if there's any sort of change, then they can actually move through that. A person has many functions. Thank you. They're in self-managing groups. They're responsible for the work outcome, the coordination and control, and they can have coherence. So it's not about actually just being completely off the planet. There has to be coherence. They can't just go off and do whatever they want. There has to be coherence with what they're doing and with what other groups are doing and what the system is trying to achieve. So it's not just about going off and doing crazy stuff. There's a third choice. The third choice is laissez-faire, not really having a clear idea about which design principle you're using. So sort of being at the mercy of like whatever turns up. Really, design principles about being intentional. Cool. Search conference and participative design workshops are how OST puts this into practice. So I won't go through them too much, except to say that search conference is about developing a strategic plan collectively, and participative design workshops are then about putting that plan into action, or building the work and the work structures that actually achieve those outcomes. One key activity here is the 6 criteria. If you don't have time for all of that, you can also create what's called a unique design, which looks at a specific problem and constructs parts of the search conference or participative design workshops to actually achieve that outcome or that specific problem. All right, the 6 criteria. Fred says if you don't get these criteria right, then there will not be the human interest to see the job through. It's that important. If any of these are lacking or poor, then you're going to be in trouble. It's not going to work. It's also done as a workshop. This is one way to apply it. Okay, the most popular way to apply it is in a workshop sort of setting. You bring the people together who are involved and you ask them about these criteria. The conversations are more important than the scores. Okay, really important in any types of these sorts of surveys that you do. It's the conversations that matter. Elbow room is the first one. Checking where I should go to down here. Okay, I have to hurry it up a little bit. This is where you have the sense of being your own boss and nobody's breathing down your neck. Okay? Too much of it though, and you don't know what's coming next, you don't know what to do next. You might feel like you're given autonomy when you don't have knowledge. Okay? And you may feel abandoned. So it's optimal. You can have too little, just right, or too much. Now, because it's post-lunch and I want to wake people up a bit, I'm going to get a bit of audience interaction in this bit to wake people up. This is where people who know me can go, woo, and people who don't know me will probably say, oh, I don't want to move. Okay, that's fine. So I'm going to go, think about a group that you're working with or that you're in. Okay, think about that group. Think about how you are in that group, because this is individual in terms of what's happening, and it's optimal. Too little, or too much, or just right. So the best place to be is a 0. Okay, that's optimal. Okay, so what I'm going to get you to do though is to put your hands in the air when I call out where you're up to, okay? Or if you're really enthusiastic, stand up and go, woo! That'd be fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to go from -5 through to +5. Ready? Off we go. -5, -4, -3, -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. We got exactly what I thought would happen in a large group, is that we get a bell curve like this. That's okay. When you're doing this with groups though, it's really important to actually look at, well, what's happening? And I've got Mary who's optimal. Well done, Mary. Tom who's got too much autonomy, so we have to talk about that. It's now about the conversations. Why does Tom feel that he's got too much autonomy? VJ and Nat sort of balance each other out, but we're definitely going to see what's going on with Nikki there, because she doesn't feel like she's got any autonomy at all. Okay? Good. The next one is continual learning. Okay? The drillers are learning about more drills or how to do different things. I won't go through this and do this with the group because they'll get a bit boring after a while, okay? But basically they can set goals that are reasonably challenging. Okay, it's not about having a boring job, it's actually having a job they're actually learning all the time. And you can get feedback, so this is a 2-parter. That's why there's 2 rows for this one. that you're getting feedback which is actually helpful and is in a timely manner. In this group, you can see, I'll pick on Nikki a little bit here. She's not being able to set goals, which are challenging, and she's probably getting way too much feedback. So you can't have too much feedback. Similarly with VJ, it looks like he doesn't have a lot of challenges in the work that he's doing. He's probably learning from it, and yeah, it's okay. He's probably getting good feedback. Okay, good. Variety. I can vary the work to avoid boredom or fatigue. Okay? I can set it into a satisfying rhythm. So it's not about having way too much variety that I can't get into a rhythm. Okay? Some people thrive on variety. Some people really don't. So this is very individual. Okay? You can see on the screen here, Nikki's got no variety. It looks like she's one person, one job in this situation probably. Tom's got too much. This has a high correlation, in this instance anyway, to the autonomy or algorithm that they have. So we have to look into why that is. Okay? Cool. Mutual support and respect are really important. This is for me one of the most important ones. Okay? If you don't have mutual support and respect, probably this whole survey is not going to work. People are going to feel like they're not respected or having the support that they need. Support to get help and to give help to workmates. Okay? So this is the first one, which is about the group and is maximal. You can't have too much of this. Okay? People are not pitted against each other. The group interest does not deny the individual capability either. So there's this concept of what's called homonymy. Say it with me. Homonymy.
Homonymy.
Homonymy means that I'm doing things not just for myself, but for the group. Okay? That's as simple as I can put it. The opposite is selfishness, where I'm doing stuff just for me. Okay? And we're going to do this one. Once again, hands in the air when I get to your number. Okay? So think about the group that you're in. This is now applying not to the individual, but to the group. Okay? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Oh, you guys are killing it. Okay. Cool. We actually, because we're in Agile, this is actually quite high in Agile groups. We can see how this might not be in a lot of groups. And in fact, when you actually drill into a lot of these things, you'll probably find that the group is fine, but the things outside of it might not be. Okay? Meaningfulness and meaningfulness. So for the miners, this was a big deal. If they didn't succeed, their town failed, their kids didn't go to school, or they had to leave town and go somewhere else. Meaningfulness is probably the killer one here in terms of what we do a lot of the time, and one in the software industry we quite often lose sight of as well. The work we do serves a socially useful purpose, and we can see the whole product end to end. I was recently working with a medical devices company. Scored really high on social useful purpose, okay? Scored really low on being able to see the whole product. Okay? So in these scores you can see once again, well, something's happening here with Mary. She's optimal and maximal. Interesting. But it's quite low. I actually scored this one quite low for these guys, okay? This is a mock one, obviously. So there's a problem there. We'd have to have a look at what the actions are here. It's not my actions, by the way. It's what the group is deciding, is what the actions that they are going to take on themselves. Last one is desirable future. And it's not about seeing the sunshine in the distance. It's actually about making sure that you have a career path, that you're not in a dead-end job, that what you're doing is leading to something in terms of where you're going in terms of your career. And it applies to the group here as well. Okay? So desirable future. Yeah. So it looks like Nikki's not doing that great. There's something going on there in terms of Mary there. Yeah? So have a look at these scores overall. There are problems. Whenever you see in anything like this, where you see somebody is fully optimized and fully maximal, there's probably a safety issue. Okay? There's probably something going on there. There's probably some reason why Mary can't actually speak her mind. We can't actually talk about what's going on. Maybe she's being KPI'd on these scores. So make them perfect. Yeah? So you've got to be really careful with the behaviours you get when you do these sorts of things. So actually talk to them. Naturally, as you're doing this is sort of a workshop with teams, that'll self-correct. Okay? Taking action. So like any retro, if you don't actually take actions from these, it's sort of pointless. You actually have to take the actions, actually follow them through. The team owns these, okay? Or the group that's working on it. If the responsibility of the action lies outside of the group, then they take that and they actually go and see how they can change it as well. Okay? Cool. My goodness, I didn't have time for questions. So glad to discuss this stuff. Whenever you do this, it's amazing what you get out of it. As a comparison to doing like a social contract sort of activity, the ones that I've done and what other practitioners have done and what they've talked about is the richness of this and the feedback you're getting from these sorts of things is actually truly impactful. Actually has a true impact on how the team is performing, but also on how joyful it is to be in that team. And these are not small things. Closing. I've got time for questions. This is amazing. I've gone too quick. Damn it. Let's go back. I'll talk more theory. So, the 6 criteria for productive work. There's 6, well, there's really 8 because there's two parts in that. Okay. Elbow room, continual learning, variety, mutual support, respect, meaningfulness, and a desirable future. These are really about intrinsic motivators. And if you've read the Dan Pink stuff, you can see some of that in what I'm talking about as well. These, I think, are minimal, which means you can add to them. Let's say you want to put in something which was saying around connectedness. You can do that as well. These are the minimal set. I know this because Fred and Merrelyn got this down from a set of like 50, okay? Increased productivity and impact from 20 to 400%, okay? I'm using social science words, not agile words. It's productivity and impact, okay? Massive. And I'm not kidding about this stuff either. 20% is minimal. You can get 20% improvement by changing the light bulbs, okay? 400%, 800%, basically you're talking about quite often teams which are failing. So if you say 1,000,000%, it doesn't really matter, okay? So 400%, it's very achievable just through this sort of activity, okay? But there's caveats. I guarantee it within the constraints of the system, which is usually the organisation. So you can only actually be as good as the organisation will let you be to a degree unless you start to challenge that. Now, that's only one small part from to do a painted design workshop. Open systems theory is actually more about enabling, if you like, the democratization of work at the whole company level. So if you really want to change this stuff, you've actually got to look at the open system theory approaches to it, especially in terms of search conference and building that strategy mindful of what's going on in the world. Okay? Change is constant. The world is not static. You're going to need an active adaptive strategy. You're going to need people who are engaged and purposeful, and you're going to need conditions that continuously are adaptive to that. Okay? This is not a one-off as well. So that means that you can't just have the consultants come in and go away and go back to normal. You've got to embed this into the DNA of your organisation. That's it. Okay. Any questions? And if you want more, we've got a LinkedIn group. I guess you can bug me on my LinkedIn group. There's a LinkedIn group there as well, and there's a link there to our opensystemstheory.org website. I will close off by saying that, similar to Agile, the goal here is not to be OST. The goal here is actually to enable organisations to be more associative, which means they're connected, okay, and actually work together. The opposite is being disassociative, meaning working in silos or working separately. It's also to be more joyful. What you'll find is that these things will just emerge. You actually have a more joyful workflow because they're learning together, they're growing together. And wise. Wise in the fact that they are actually thinking strategically about where they're going and how they can get there. Cool. Any questions?
Thanks, Dave. We probably have time for one quick question. Have you just
No, not Derek.
Hello, Dave. Great presentation. Really easy. Did you do those? Hello, Dave. Great presentation and story. Easy question. Did you do those drawings yourself?
You know, only that one minute. The only thing people will get out of this is the drawing. Yes, I did draw those.
Thanks, Dave. Okay, we are actually out of time.